The final months of World War II had turned into a grueling and terrifying race toward the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. As the Allies steadily pushed forward, the full extent of the horrors hidden in the concentration camps became evident. These camps, shrouded in secrecy and designed to break the spirits of those imprisoned within, were not only sites of brutal labor and torture but also places where the very essence of humanity was systematically dismantled. The prisoners within these walls were mere shadows of their former selves, emaciated, exhausted, and shattered both physically and mentally. To the outside world, these camps remained largely unknown, their horrors obscured by the strategic silence of Nazi propaganda. But as the Allied forces closed in, that silence began to crack, revealing a horrific truth. By the time the British forces reached one such camp, the prisoners had long since lost any hope of rescue. Starvation had stripped them of their strength, and disease had ravaged their bodies. The once vibrant individuals, full of dreams and histories, had been reduced to barely functional beings, consumed by the overwhelming agony of their existence. For months, they had been subjected to forced labor, starvation rations, and physical abuse. Some had been imprisoned for their ethnicity, others for their political beliefs or religious practices, but all had endured the same unrelenting torment. It had not just been a battle for survival, it had been a brutal stripping away of every human right and dignity. Many had long since given up on the hope of ever being freed, resigned to the belief that death would be their final release. But as the sounds of war began to echo closer, a glimmer of possibility emerged, albeit faint and fragile. The prisoners had overheard whispers among the guards, rumors of the advancing Allied forces. But these whispers brought no joy. Instead, they brought only more fear, the kind born of years of despair. To them, the presence of the Allies was not a sign of salvation but a harbinger of further suffering. There were stories of camps being abandoned in chaos, with the prisoners left behind to fend for themselves. Others feared that the Nazi regime would retaliate by executing those who had survived the brutality of the camps, ensuring that no one would be left to witness the atrocities that had occurred. Even in the face of approaching liberation, they were consumed by the belief that death was inevitable. In those final days of starvation, with the walls closing in on them, the prisoners began to whisper their goodbyes. They did not do so with grand gestures or dramatic farewells, but in quiet, resigned tones. Their voices were weak, barely audible above the groans of those suffering around them. These were not farewell words spoken in love or in hope, but whispered words of finality, words born from the certainty that their time had come. They had lived through the worst, and now, with the end in sight, they were prepared to meet their fate. For many, these final words were not just a parting from life but a farewell to all they had once known. Their families, their homes, their communities, all were lost to them now. They had become ghosts in their own lives, forgotten by a world that had turned its back on them long ago. In their final moments, as they prepared to meet death, they whispered to one another, some offering what little comfort they could, others simply acknowledging the inevitability of their fate. These goodbyes were not spoken with the hope that anyone would hear them or that anything would change. Instead, they were a reflection of the prisoners' deepest resignation, the recognition that their lives had been reduced to this final, solitary moment. The whispers spread throughout the camp, as the prisoners looked at each other with hollow eyes. There was no sense of peace in these goodbyes, only a profound sorrow, a shared understanding of the depth of their suffering. Each prisoner, in their isolation, felt as if they were the last remaining soul, trapped in a place where no one could reach them. It was as though the very air itself was suffocating them, the weight of death pressing down on their fragile bodies. Yet, even as they whispered their farewells, there was a flicker of defiance within them, a fleeting, almost imperceptible wish that somehow, someway, they might survive. But that hope was faint, almost non-existent, for they had been conditioned by years of suffering to believe that survival was a cruel mirage, always just out of reach. The brutality of their captors had eroded any sense of trust in the world around them. The Nazis had systematically broken down any semblance of order or morality within the camp, and the prisoners had come to accept the notion that they were nothing more than expendable commodities. They were the forgotten, the ignored, the invisible casualties of a war that had long since ceased to care for their plight. But in those final moments, as the Allies advanced and the end of the war loomed on the horizon, something shifted. The whispered goodbyes, the quiet resignation to their fate, were not the end of their story. They were, in fact, the beginning of something more profound, something no one could have predicted. In the heart of despair, where survival seemed impossible, a new chapter was about to be written, one that would change the course of their suffering. It would be a chapter marked by unexpected compassion, the kind that could break through even the darkest of places. For all the whispers of goodbyes, there was still a flicker of humanity left, something the captors could never completely extinguish. And that flicker would soon ignite into a force far stronger than anyone could have imagined, setting the stage for a moral reversal that would change the lives of the prisoners and the soldiers who came to their aid. This moment of finality, where the prisoners whispered their goodbyes in fear, was the tragic and poignant backdrop against which an act of extraordinary kindness would unfold. It was the last breath of hopelessness before the winds of change began to blow. And in those whispers, in those final goodbyes, lay the seeds of a profound transformation, the story of which was just beginning to take shape. It would be a story of survival, of humanity found in the most unlikely of places, and of the compassion that could overcome even the most brutal of circumstances. The whispered goodbyes were not an end, they were merely the final echo before the dawn of a new, unexpected beginning. As the British forces advanced through the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, their soldiers encountered a nightmare beyond any of their expectations. The landscape of destruction was unlike anything they had ever imagined, with every corner of the continent scarred by the ravages of war. Yet, what awaited them at the concentration camps was something even more horrifying. A human suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. The soldiers, already battle-hardened by years of conflict, had come to expect the worst, but nothing could have prepared them for the abject devastation they found within those walls. What they encountered was not just a physical landscape of ruin, but a profound moral crisis, an encounter with human suffering so extreme that it shook their very souls. When the British soldiers arrived at one particular camp, they were faced with a sight that would haunt them forever. Rows upon rows of skeletal figures, their bodies gaunt and frail from months, if not years, of starvation and abuse. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sounds of weak, labored breaths filled the camp. The prisoners had been reduced to mere shells of their former selves, their spirits long broken by the unrelenting cruelty of their captors. The British soldiers, many of whom had grown numb to the violence of war, were shocked to their core by the sight before them. It was as though they had stumbled into a waking nightmare, a place where human dignity had been completely eradicated. At first, the soldiers did not know how to respond. They had been trained to fight, to defeat the enemy, and to secure victory on the battlefield. But here, in the concentration camp, they faced something that no amount of training could prepare them for, a moral dilemma of the highest order. These were not enemy combatants. They were civilians, innocent victims of a brutal regime. And yet, they were as much a part of the war as any soldier on the front lines. The soldiers stood in stunned silence, unsure of how to proceed. What could they possibly do in the face of such suffering? How could they offer any relief when the scale of the disaster seemed so vast? As the soldiers began to gather themselves, they were faced with the immediate reality of the situation. The prisoners, in their emaciated states, were unable to move. Many could not even lift their heads, their bodies too weak to respond to the presence of the British troops. Others were too far gone, their bodies ravaged by starvation and disease, and there was little the soldiers could do to save them. Yet, despite the overwhelming despair that surrounded them, something began to shift in the hearts of the soldiers. It was as though a collective decision had been made, an unspoken understanding that something had to be done. The soldiers realized that they could not simply stand by and witness this horror without taking action. The first step was to provide basic humanitarian aid, food, water, and medicine. The soldiers began distributing what little they had, offering small portions of bread and water to the starving prisoners. It was a simple act, yet for the prisoners, it was a lifeline. The soldiers had been taught to see the world in terms of enemies and allies, of battlefields and victories, But in this moment, they were confronted with something far more fundamental: the humanity of the people before them. These were not just victims of war, they were fellow human beings, deserving of dignity and compassion, regardless of their past or their circumstances. The realization hit hard as the soldiers saw the prisoners begin to respond, albeit weakly, to their gestures of kindness. For some, it was a flicker of hope in a world that had long since abandoned them. For others, it was a brief moment of relief, a chance to taste something other than the bitterness of starvation. The British officers, many of whom had seen the worst of the war, were particularly moved by the condition of the prisoners. These men, who had faced death on countless battlefields, were now confronted with a new form of trauma, one that could not be measured by the numbers on a battlefield, but by the depth of suffering that was etched into every line of the prisoners' faces. The officers were forced to confront the limits of their own training, to acknowledge that they had been prepared for the physical violence of war but not for the moral challenges that came with it. In those moments, they were no longer soldiers fighting a war, they were human beings, witnessing the consequences of inhumanity on an unimaginable scale. As the days went on, the British soldiers began to organize themselves into a more coordinated effort. They worked together to provide as much care as they could, bringing in medical supplies and attempting to stabilize the most severely malnourished prisoners. The efforts were, of course, far from perfect. The resources were limited, and the number of prisoners in need was overwhelming. But the soldiers were determined to do what they could to provide the kind of care that would help to restore some semblance of dignity to those who had been stripped of everything. It was a delicate balancing act, for the soldiers knew that the prisoners' suffering could not be erased with a few simple gestures. They had seen the ravages of war firsthand, but the scale of suffering within these camps was unlike anything they had encountered before. For every prisoner they helped, there were 10 more who were beyond saving. In the midst of this chaos, something remarkable began to happen. The prisoners, many of whom had lost all faith in humanity, began to respond. Slowly at first, but with increasing urgency, they began to reach out to the soldiers, not just for food or water, but for something deeper, a connection, a sign that they had not been forgotten. It was as if the mere presence of the British soldiers was a reminder that they were still human, still capable of compassion. The soldiers, in turn, began to realize that their role in this moment was not just to provide aid, but to offer something even more profound: hope. For so long, the prisoners had believed that they were invisible, that their suffering had been ignored by the world. But now, in this bleak, broken place, they were seen. And in that moment of recognition, something shifted in both the soldiers and the prisoners. The British soldiers found themselves in a new kind of battle, one that could not be won with weapons or tactics, but with something far more elusive: compassion. They had fought on the front lines of war, but now they were fighting for the lives and dignity of those who had already been subjected to unimaginable horrors. As the soldiers worked tirelessly to aid the prisoners, they began to understand that their actions, though small, could make a profound difference in the lives of these people. It was not just a matter of survival, it was a matter of restoring their humanity, piece by piece. As the prisoners began to regain their strength, however slowly, a transformation began to take place, not just in their bodies, but in their hearts and minds. Many began to believe, perhaps for the first time in years, that they might survive. They saw that the world had not entirely forgotten them, that there was still a flicker of kindness amidst the darkness. The British soldiers, in their own way, had become symbols of that kindness. In a world where cruelty had reigned for so long, these soldiers had proven that even in the most broken of places, compassion could still take root. And in that moment, the soldiers themselves were forever changed. No longer just soldiers in a war, they had become witnesses to something far greater than the battles they had fought: the possibility of redemption, the power of human decency in the face of unimaginable evil. As the British forces continued their efforts to provide aid to the camp, the moral reversal was undeniable. What had once been a symbol of despair, a place where hope had long since been extinguished, had slowly begun to transform into something else, a place where the human spirit could begin to heal. The soldiers, many of whom had been hardened by war, found themselves grappling with emotions they had not anticipated: empathy, compassion, and the quiet recognition that their presence in this camp was not just a military victory but a victory for humanity itself. It was a small, fragile victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for the first time in a long while, both the soldiers and the prisoners could see a future, no matter how uncertain, where survival and dignity might be reclaimed. As the days turned into weeks, the efforts of the British soldiers in the concentration camp began to yield tangible results, though not without a deep sense of struggle and an emotional complexity that none had expected. The survivors, many of whom had been reduced to mere shadows of their former selves, found themselves caught between two overwhelming forces, hope and disbelief. The soldiers had delivered food, water, and medicine, but the transformation of these broken bodies and minds was not immediate. It wasn't just a matter of physical healing. The emotional and psychological scars of starvation, brutality, and isolation were far more difficult to repair. The survivors had been pushed to the very edges of human endurance, and their bodies and spirits were stretched thin. They had learned, over years of torment, not to trust the world or anyone in it. The soldiers' compassion, though tangible and genuine, could not erase the brutal experiences these prisoners had lived through. For many, the simple act of receiving care seemed like a betrayal of their years of suffering. How could something so simple and pure exist in a world that had already stripped them of so much? For the first time in years, the prisoners had been given a choice they had long believed was taken from them forever. They could now begin to rebuild, but the decision was not as straightforward as one might imagine. After so much suffering, it was difficult to trust that the kindness being extended to them was real. Many could not fully grasp the significance of the change unfolding around them. Even when food and water were placed in front of them, many could not bring themselves to eat. Their bodies, conditioned to endure the most severe forms of deprivation, could no longer recognize the abundance that was now available to them. They had been starved for so long that the very act of consuming food felt foreign, even dangerous. It was as though they had lost the capacity for trust in the simplest of human acts, nourishment. The British soldiers, too, were learning in real time how to offer what they could. They had come with training for war, for battle, but not for the aftermath of cruelty so severe that it had stripped away the very will to live. Their knowledge of physical recovery was limited, but they were forced to make decisions that went beyond military tactics. They began to understand that their mission now was not simply to deliver aid but to help restore the prisoners' shattered sense of self-worth. Each meal was not just a matter of sustenance. It was an invitation to believe, once more, that life held value. Each cup of water, each gentle word of reassurance, was a tiny thread of trust being woven back into the fabric of these broken lives. The prisoners' war was not over. It had merely entered a new phase, one where they had to reconcile what they had experienced with the possibility of a future beyond the camps. For the soldiers, the process of offering kindness was a test of endurance in itself. Many had witnessed violence on the battlefield, but they had not expected to face the depth of human suffering that now lay before them. It was one thing to fight for survival in the chaos of war, but it was another entirely to witness a form of cruelty so systematic and cold that it seemed to erase the very essence of humanity. Many of the soldiers found themselves questioning everything they had ever believed about the war, about their enemies, and even about their role in this vast, tragic conflict. How could they, with all their weapons and training, have allowed this suffering to go on for so long? What was the purpose of their struggle, if not to prevent this kind of atrocity? The compassion they offered now seemed so small in the face of the devastation they had encountered. Yet, despite these doubts, they continued to give what they could. They had no other choice but to continue, for they had been sent to liberate the camp, not just in the physical sense, but in a moral sense as well. The prisoners began to regain some measure of strength, albeit slowly. For many, the physical restoration was almost as difficult as the emotional one. Their bodies had become accustomed to a state of constant deprivation, and now they had to relearn how to exist in a world where they could be nourished and cared for. It was not a simple process. In the beginning, the prisoners' movements were sluggish, hesitant, as though their bodies were still in shock. Even simple tasks, such as standing or walking, became monumental challenges. Their limbs, once capable of fighting, had been reduced to trembling, fragile appendages. But as the food began to nourish them, something else began to stir inside them. The faintest trace of hope, a fragile, tentative belief that perhaps they might survive this. That belief was not fully formed yet, but it had begun to take root. The prisoners who had once whispered goodbyes now found themselves, slowly and unwillingly, starting to dream of a future that included life rather than death. But that hope was not an easy thing to embrace. It was like a flame flickering in the wind, constantly threatened by the doubts and fears that had been planted in them by years of brutality. The psychological toll of their experiences was not easily undone. The emotional scars ran deeper than any wound could. Some of the prisoners, despite the physical improvements, found themselves haunted by the memories of what they had endured. The horrors they had witnessed, the people they had lost, the violence they had experienced, all of it lingered, like a dark cloud hovering over their newfound hope. They could not forget what had happened to them, and perhaps, in some ways, they did not want to forget. Their suffering had become an integral part of their identity, and now, as they began to heal, they had to navigate the difficult question of who they were without it. Were they still the same people they had been before the war? Or had the war taken something from them that could never be restored? The soldiers, too, were grappling with their own internal conflict. They had come to liberate, to free the prisoners, but in doing so, they had also set in motion a much larger process. A process of healing that would require more than just food and medicine. They had unknowingly become part of something much greater than a military operation. They were no longer just soldiers. They were witnesses to history, participants in a moment that could not be undone. Each act of kindness they offered was a small step toward redemption, not only for the prisoners but for themselves as well. The soldiers had seen the worst of humanity in the war, but here, in this camp, they saw the possibility of something different. The potential for healing, for reconciliation, for the restoration of what had been lost. As the days passed, the prisoners grew stronger. Their bodies, though still fragile, were beginning to recover from the years of abuse they had endured. But even more important was the change in their hearts. The survivors, once broken by the harshness of the world, were now beginning to open up again. The soldiers, though they could never fully understand the depth of what these prisoners had experienced, found themselves drawn into their stories, their lives. They listened, not with pity but with respect. The survivors began to speak once more, telling their stories of survival, of loss, of courage. In that process of sharing their experiences, they began to reclaim their voices, to regain a sense of identity and purpose. The prisoners had not been silenced forever. They had merely been temporarily overwhelmed by the weight of their suffering. And now, in the presence of the soldiers, they began to speak again. It was a slow, painful process, rebuilding lives that had been shattered, restoring dignity to those who had been robbed of it. But it was also a beautiful process. The soldiers and prisoners had come together in a way that neither side had ever imagined. What had begun as a military intervention had transformed into something far more personal and profound. They were no longer just liberators and the liberated. They were fellow human beings, bound by a shared experience of suffering and survival. And in that shared experience, something remarkable had occurred. A glimmer of hope had been reignited, not just for the prisoners but for all involved. The survivors had come to believe, if only for a moment, that the world could be a place of kindness and compassion. And the soldiers, though forever changed by what they had witnessed, had come to understand that their role in this war was not just to fight, but to restore what had been lost. The days following the British soldiers' intervention were a mixture of fragile optimism and the harsh reality of what the survivors had endured. Though the immediate impact of their compassion had begun to heal the bodies of the prisoners, the emotional and psychological scars lingered, much harder to treat. The physical revival was slow and painful, and for some, it was simply too late. The years of abuse and neglect had left many beyond recovery. Their frail bodies, once vibrant and full of life, had succumbed to the relentless toll of starvation and disease. No amount of food, water, or medicine could undo the damage done to their bodies. The realization that there was nothing the soldiers could do for some of them was a cruel blow, a reminder that not all the prisoners would survive this forced rebirth. Their deaths were not easy to witness, and yet, in this grim environment, they felt almost inevitable. The soldiers, despite their best efforts, found themselves facing an emotional wall they had not anticipated. They had entered this mission as soldiers, ready to fight, to liberate, to win. But what they had not been prepared for was the deeply personal toll of seeing life in its most fragile form. The survivors were not simply numbers or abstract statistics. They were real people, each with their own stories, each with their own losses. The British soldiers had fought against the Nazi regime, against an enemy that had been faceless and dehumanized. But now they saw human faces, fragile, broken faces, that had endured the worst of what humanity could inflict. Some of the soldiers began to question the very meaning of the war they had been fighting. They had been told that they were fighting for freedom, for the preservation of justice. Yet, as they stood among these survivors, they began to wonder if the war had truly been worth the cost. For the prisoners who had begun to recover, there was a complex emotional journey that unfolded. For some, the sudden influx of compassion from the soldiers ignited a spark of hope they had not dared to feel for years. These survivors, though weak, began to rediscover the simple joys of life, drinking clean water, tasting fresh food, and, most poignantly, reconnecting with their own humanity. The kindness extended to them was an unfamiliar experience, one they could not immediately trust. It was hard to reconcile the cruelty they had lived through with the acts of generosity now being shown to them. They had been trained, by years of abuse, to view the world through a lens of survival, suspicion, and fear. Trust had been eroded over time, so deeply that it was almost impossible to accept anything that was not laced with an underlying motive. The idea that people could act selflessly was foreign to them. As the days passed, however, many of them began to change. It wasn't a simple transformation, nor was it without setbacks. Every step forward felt fragile, and the survivors constantly grappled with the memories of the past. They found themselves torn between the survival instinct that had kept them alive and the strange new reality being offered by the British soldiers. To trust again meant to expose themselves to further pain, and many prisoners were unwilling to let go of their defensive walls. Yet, in small and tentative ways, they began to accept what had been offered to them. The food that had once seemed impossible to consume began to nourish them. The water that they had once feared would never come was now plentiful, and with each drink, their bodies slowly started to rebuild. But it was the soldiers' gestures, small, consistent, and often understated, that seemed to have the most profound impact. In a world that had been governed by the indifference of the Nazis, the soldiers' simple kindnesses, a hand offered, a word of reassurance, a quiet, steady presence, began to have a lasting effect. They were not heroes in the traditional sense of the word. They were not leading battles or making grand speeches. Instead, they were offering something far more precious: human connection. Their willingness to look beyond the battlefield and extend compassion to those who had been dehumanized was nothing short of remarkable. It was, in a way, an act of defiance against the very forces that had sought to strip the prisoners of their humanity. By seeing them as human beings, the British soldiers were not just liberating their bodies but also their souls. Still, the process was not without its complications. Even as the survivors began to regain their physical strength, they struggled with the psychological weight of their experience. The trauma of their years in the camp was not something that could be erased with food or medicine. The prisoners who had endured the most intense suffering now found themselves grappling with a new set of challenges: how to process the sheer magnitude of what had happened to them. Many survivors found themselves haunted by the memories of their lost loved ones, the faces of those who had not made it out of the camp, the sounds of the cruel guards, and the ever-present fear that had permeated every moment of their lives. This trauma was something the soldiers could not fix, no matter how much care they offered. The survivors had been broken in ways that were not immediately visible, and their journey to healing would take years, if not a lifetime. The soldiers, despite their best efforts, found themselves unable to fill the void left by the devastation. They could offer the prisoners food and shelter, but they could not undo the past. They could not replace what had been lost. They could not restore the families that had been torn apart or the lives that had been shattered. This realization began to weigh heavily on the soldiers' hearts. They had been trained to be warriors, to fight for victory, and yet they had never been prepared to confront the aftermath of such profound destruction. The prisoners, despite their resilience, were now confronted with a new struggle: how to move forward in a world that had taken so much from them. Some prisoners, despite their recovery, found it difficult to adapt to the new reality. They had been so conditioned by years of suffering that even when faced with kindness, they could not fully accept it. Their bodies may have begun to heal, but their minds were still trapped in the trauma of their past. For others, the idea of survival became something of a burden. They had been through so much pain that the thought of trying to rebuild their lives seemed overwhelming. How could they begin to heal when their entire identity had been forged in the fires of suffering? They had lived through horrors beyond comprehension, and now they were faced with the daunting task of redefining themselves in a world that no longer seemed familiar. The soldiers watched this process unfold with a deep sense of helplessness. They had done their best to offer what they could, but they realized, as the days wore on, that their efforts were limited. The survivors, though they were physically healing, were not yet whole. The journey to recovery was far from over, and it would take more than food and medicine to rebuild the lives of those who had been so broken. The British soldiers had witnessed the worst of humanity, but now they were witnessing something even more profound: the resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything the prisoners had endured, they had not given up entirely. There was still a flicker of hope in each of them, a desire to survive, to rebuild, and to move forward. The process of healing, both physical and emotional, was a slow and difficult one. Yet it was also a reminder of the power of compassion. The prisoners who had once whispered their goodbyes were now beginning to find their voices again. The soldiers, despite their uncertainty and the overwhelming nature of their task, had begun to offer something that went beyond aid: the opportunity for the survivors to reclaim their humanity. It was not an easy process, and it was not without setbacks, but it was a process that had begun, and it was one that would continue long after the soldiers had left. For now, though, the survivors had been given the chance to begin again, albeit tentatively, and with many challenges ahead. Yet, in the face of overwhelming despair, they had found something that had eluded them for so long: hope. As the survivors of the concentration camp began to regain some semblance of physical strength, the British soldiers found themselves confronting a new and complex reality. The process of recovery was not linear, nor was it as simple as providing food and medicine. The emotional toll of the prisoners' experiences, the deep psychological wounds inflicted by years of dehumanization, were far more difficult to address. The soldiers, despite their initial shock and the humanity they had shown, were now realizing the profound limits of their ability to heal these broken souls. The survivors were not merely patients to be cared for. They were people whose identities had been shaped by immense suffering, whose memories were laden with trauma. The soldiers had come to liberate them physically, but they had also inadvertently opened a door to a deeper, more difficult journey, one of psychological healing, one that would require far more than they could offer. For the British soldiers, the experience had been transformative in ways they had never anticipated. They had come to liberate the camp, to provide physical aid and comfort, but what they had not expected was the deep emotional and moral reckoning that came with witnessing the aftermath of such brutality. Many of the soldiers had been hardened by the war, their hearts armored against the horrors they had witnessed on the front lines. But here, in the camp, they were confronted with something even more unsettling: the fragility of life, the profound depths of human suffering, and the stark realization that no amount of military victory or strategy could undo the damage that had been done. They had been trained to fight battles, to defeat enemies, but they had not been prepared to witness the aftermath of such a war. They had not been trained to restore humanity to those who had been reduced to nothing. As the days passed and the survivors' health began to improve, the soldiers found themselves grappling with an increasing sense of helplessness. Despite all their efforts, the emotional scars of the prisoners could not be erased with a simple gesture of kindness or a meal. The psychological damage was far deeper, and it was something that could not be remedied by even the most well-intentioned actions. The soldiers, for the first time, began to understand that their role in this recovery process was not just about providing immediate relief but about offering something much more difficult to give: the space for the survivors to begin their own healing. It was no longer about them simply being caretakers. It was about allowing the prisoners to reclaim their sense of self, to rediscover their agency in a world that had sought to strip it from them. The survivors, though they were beginning to recover physically, still found themselves haunted by the memories of what they had endured. The horrors they had witnessed in the camp, the beatings, the starvation, the deaths of their fellow prisoners, had left indelible marks on their psyches. Many of the survivors were plagued by nightmares, flashes of memories that would not let them go. The simple act of trying to rest, to find peace, became a battle in itself. For some, the trauma was so severe that even the kindness of the soldiers seemed almost irrelevant.